Welcome to week 3 of Quantum Wizardry as we look at empathic awareness, embodiment, and emotions. To start this today, we're going to look at this phrase to provide us context. Emotion can be a portal to the past and to our presence. We decide which. What we're going to be really diving into in this week's lesson is a conversation about the true nature of emotion and how we can work with this both intuitively and also allow it to be very supportive in terms of freeing ourselves from our own personal narrative. And so our overview is really going to look at for today's presentation is how the emotional and physical bodies are related, looking at the three layers of emotion, looking at the polarity of our feelings, and then how this ties into the astral realm and transitioning a bit into our empathic abilities. Now, to provide a little more context, let's revisit Dr. David Hawkins' scale of consciousness because we'll be looking at this generally as a way to provide context for emotion. You can see at the very bottommost aspect in the arena of fear, shame at 20 points, and then at the very top we have in the arena of love and more of that expanded consciousness, enlightenment at 700 plus. And so we, in every aspect of our lives, have different areas that we have different emotions for. And what we look at then, whether we're talking about the social component or the intellectual or the physical aspect, is that we have an average of all of these states of being. And that is generally what we look at related to this scale of consciousness. Now, as we dive a little bit further, though, into it, let's revisit that four body system. Now, we have that energetic awareness. Now, this is related to the quantum field or wave. It's the interconnected bands of frequency that construct reality. I kind of think of it as little dots. If you think about a TV screen, for example, they're little dots that light up, and it has the appearance of movement on the TV screen itself, when actuality, different dots on that screen are actually creating and illuminating a certain radiance. Now, if that's sort of the general piece of it, in this case, let's say that's the ocean at large, water particles in this larger, bigger, fluid construct in reality, then we have our own field of consciousness. Now, this is our psychic awareness or our morphogenetic field. This is a stream of consciousness that really houses information of a quote unquote individualized self. I like the example that is given in The Universal One by Sir Walter Russell. And it talks about, say, for example, a steamboat pushing through the ocean. Now, as this steamboat pushes through the ocean, there is a wake that it creates. And that wake creates bubbles that ripple as well as waves. And this effect that the ocean has in response to this large vessel is seemingly separate, right? We see the bubbles floating, we see the waves, and while they're seemingly separate and independent, in actuality, it's still connected to the ocean. So our morphogenetic field is a field of information that houses all of the information, the data, in this case, of ourself. Now, as it comes into play, then we have our kinesthetic awareness. This is the space-time field. This is our perception of reality. The three dimensions of space and one dimension of time really creates that field of matter. And as we talked about previously with the zeros and ones, then that's something that really comes into play as how our body manifests these different effects. Now, for our point this week, what we're looking at really is that concept of empathic awareness tied to the astral field and realm. It really is all that is, was, and shall be. This ties us to the collective unconscious, as Carl Jung identifies as this underlying storehouse of information and experiences. And that's a key word in this that we're going to see in just a bit. And recognizing that as it localizes, it comes into what's known as our chakra fields. Now, our chakra, the system of expression can affect and influence how our consciousness actually passes through the body. As it comes into play, then we look at the 7 of these housed within our physical being and recognize that each and every one of them actually has a different opportunity, a different lesson, and are sensitive to different emotions and sensations. Kind of going a little bit further with that, then we're going to see that what actually comes into play, and we'll come back to this in week 4 as well as in week 5. But the 7 chakra systems are actually related to 7 primary principles. These 7 primary principles are called hermetic principles and correspond with the crown, the third eye, the throat, heart, the solar plexus, sacral, and the root chakra. Starting at the bottom, we have the principle of gender, and that's that masculine and feminine principle. Also goes into a deeper sensation of belonging and can also go into abandonment. Going into the principle of rhythm, the ebb and the flow of things ties to our own vitality and can come into a place of distortion with a sensation of scarcity. Cause and effect, looking at, while right now is absolutely the cause of multiple and honestly innumerable, or rather is the effect of innumerable causes, that we also right now have the opportunity to be the cause of new effects. This ties to willpower and the sensation of powerlessness. Polarity then comes into a place of unity, and on the flip side, when it's more distorted, comes into a place of duality and separation. Otherwise, we can also look at it as a place of connectivity and disconnectivity. The principle of vibration, everything is always and ever in motion, can come into place with a throat then in terms of expression, personal truth, and also suppression or repression. The principle of correspondence, as above, so below, as within, so without, comes into a place of perception, our capacity to see beyond illusion and to actually see what is. And we'll talk a little bit more about illusion and how our emotions can actually color the lenses that we actually see and perceive through. Finally, the principle of mentality, to think is to create. That comes from a place of inspiration. What is it that we desire to do or are inspired by? And what is it that we rather than use external reference points as a way to motivate ourselves? Now we can see that there are a number of sensitivities, and these are all connected. When we have our chakra systems and we're dealing through any and perhaps all of these, we see a decrease of flow of our consciousness, going back to that morphogenetic field that's always there. It is always beaming. It is always and ever present. Kind of think of this as cell phone reception. Now, when our emotions, especially when we're dealing with specific issues related to any of these and beyond, that affect and influence our chakra system, can also affect and influence our receptivity to our own signal. So put differently, if you have a cell phone, for example, with one bar because you're behind a mountain, there's something that's inhibiting that signal to be received. Now, when we change positions, when we shift, when we move on into a new area and arena, that may increase to 2 bars, 3 bars. We may get 4 bars when we're at the top of that mountain and actually clearly and more ably to receive that information coming in through the cell phone tower. In this case, though, that cell phone signal is a matter of our own morphogenetic field, and our capacity to receive is affected and influenced by our emotions. Now, when we look at 3 layers of emotion, as the phrase implied initially, that emotions can be a portal. In this case, a time-traveling vortex. So when we think about a vortex, for example, we come back to the whole concept of the theory of relativity, and we see then that we can access 2 different points in space, in this case, in time, by looking at the 3 layers of emotion that our present moment can be influenced by our connection to our past. And the more connected we are to our past via emotion, the more difficult it can be to truly create a connection to our presence. Now, with the three layers of emotion, what we're talking about is, first and foremost, there's the emotion that I'm feeling. These are the sensations that we are experiencing right now. Often we have feelings about the emotion that we're feeling or experiencing. And these impressions that we are experiencing about our emotions can come into play. Say, for example, I have a health, a health goal or aspiration, and I decide to eat an entire pizza. Okay, my emotions might be one of sadness that I went back on my word. Now, my feelings about my sadness might be guilt, that I feel guilty for feeling bad or sad in this case because I made a decision. Now, what led to that moment could have actually been, and this is where we go into number 3, me being in a stressed state as a child and dealing with that from a survivalistic perspective by reacting and eating something to escape the sensations of sadness and guilt. So we have these three layers and, to a certain degree, levels. The emotion that we're feeling, the feelings that we're feeling, and the experience that it comes from. Looking back at the exercises this past week, for example, we're looking at how can we use that release or that letting go breath work to be able to recognize what it is that we are experiencing, the sensations and impressions we're going through, and just acknowledging it. By just acknowledging whatever the emotions and feelings we are going through allows a lot of that energy to actually dissipate. Now, where this comes into play, if we look at, for example, Dr. Joe Dispenza's work with, I believe, You Are the Placebo, talks about creating reality, and that the mind is unable to differentiate between what is happening, quote unquote, now and what is happening then. Often when we experience something, especially when we're triggered, we go back to certain moments in time. And we may relive that in our mind, and our mind, unable to differentiate, will create a myriad of experiences and emotions that are real, very real for the body. Now, where that can come into play is that perhaps it's not even a matter of something that I've experienced within my lifetime. Perhaps it's something that I have inherited. Going a step further, then we look at Dr. Bruce Lipton's concept as he explores the biology of belief and looks at this whole epigenetic link. How can the values, beliefs, the emotions of our parents, of our grandparents, of those ancestors who have come before us affect us now? And recognizing that there is a link. And so now we start to go into a couple of different things, because now we also have this piece not of just a matter of my own life's experiences. We also go a step further into looking at what about those who came before me? What are the inherited patterns that I'm working with from a genetic or ancestral link? One step further, back to David Hawkins, talks about these different concepts of attachments, and also goes into, to a certain degree, the concept of past lives. Now, what if the experiences that I'm having are not actually, or rather the experiences that are influencing my sensations and emotions now are not of this lifetime? Consciousness, our awareness, that morphogenetic field is something that can come into form. And definitely the emotions that we experience are things that we can go through as well in our life. However, what if the emotions, the triggers, the reactions actually come from a lifetime that predates this specific incarnation? These attachments, and that's where we really don't necessarily need to identify the experience that it comes from as much as a sensation that we are going through. Because as we go through the process of release and letting go, coming back to that breath work that came out in the email at the beginning of the week, then what we're able to do is to dissolve a lot of the attachments that have and hold us in a certain place. Now, the thing about it is that the spectrum of emotion by no means is negative. It's a natural part of our life's experiences. The thing to really come back to as we look at this empathic awareness, right, the emotional body, is that there's a spectrum of emotion, and each and every aspect of this spectrum has value, wisdom, and opportunity. Everything that exists on this spectrum, if we are sad, for example, angry, or embarrassed about something, then that also means that we have the capacity to experience and elicit those opposites: joy, happiness, wonder, grace. And that as we go into that, these heavier, denser energies, when we are able to view, not quite dispassionately, yet disconnected from the emotion of that moment, that there is true value. And the value is connecting with the wisdom of it. So, say, for example, I go back to that period where I am triggered, I'm stress eating, I eat the whole pizza, I feel bad about it, I feel embarrassed about it, yada, yada, yada. The opportunity, the wisdom is to recognize that this is a trigger. I am being triggered by something, and that this is my reaction. And how can I move beyond this state of stress and reactivity? Viktor Frankl, as he talks about in his book Man's Search for Meaning, touches upon this point. And he, who had been placed into a German concentration camp during World War II, experienced horrendous things. And he was able to not merely survive, which he did, he was able to thrive in that this whole experience spurred an entire school of existential psychology, an entire way to view things drastically differently from at that point was very much a more of a Pavlovian piece, where there are things that stimulate a reaction, and we are very much rudimentary beings. Viktor Frankl saw it differently. He experienced it differently because he was able, in all of the horrors and the horrendous experiences that he went through, was able to connect with how is it that we can experience life from a place that true perspective enables us to see things from a very different perception. And as we go into that, and as we look at this, the cosmic scale, right, we can swing from one side to the other. These emotions have a range and spectrum. And if we look at this picture, right in the middle where that zero is, and this picture coming from the Universal One, back to Sir Walter Russell, looks at a place of inertia. This is where things come from and always come back to. So when we can connect to the guiding principles of the spectrum and the range of our emotion, the true value and wisdom of each and every experience inevitably leads to an opportunity. Our capacity to get there is what really comes into play. Now, this image comes from the HeartMath Institute and looks at things to better identify what we're experiencing in the moment. And so we have things that are more renewing and positive. Those are things that are like love and appreciation, and on the opposite side, more negative, frustration and resentment. Those have different effects. One has an effect of a stress response. One affects us in a very different way in creating more ease and grace. We also have the high end of that spectrum, which on the negative aspect can be a matter of anger and anxiety. On the positive end can be one of happiness and excitement. On the bottom end, then we have contentment and serenity. And then on the negative side, apathy and sadness. And I want to just clarify that the negative and the positive is more easily identifiable as we look at what is renewing and what is depleting. So as we go through this week and continue with this work, what I really want to bring home is a pathway to liberate ourselves from these past experiences. And one way to look at that is, what is it that renews? What is it that depletes? Because the more that we can spend time in a place of renewal, the more renewed, right, that we will be. And where this comes into play is that as we continue to spend more time on this side of the spectrum, then inevitably what happens is we're able to live in a more enlivened and radiant state. And what this allows, as we really shift into this, is more access to our intuitive abilities. And so, as we talked about in week one, that it is related to a certain degree, the pathway that our mind and how our mind works. And we'll talk about this in week four, specifically with psychic abilities. However, a lot of the time, we spend more time in our left hemisphere of the brain. And this is great with fixed information and data and processing. However, our intuitive abilities more so exist within our right hemisphere, the creative, imaginative, feeling aspect of ourself. And so as we're in a more place of renewal, in this case, less stressed, in a state of ease and grace, we have more access to, specifically with our empathic, intuitive awareness, the cloud. Now, I use this generically as a way to sort of create context for the astral realm. Now, the astral realm, again, is the storehouse of all that is, was, and shall be, because it really comes back to experience. Now, if we think about this in the context of the cloud, sort of that, etheric, not quite imaginary, digital storehouse of information, in this case, experience, we can upload all sorts of things, right? We can create files, and those files can have like audio, media, video, PDFs, whatever, housed inside of them. Now, the thing about that is our life is like downloading an aspect of that file, right? We have connection to this specific cloud, and in this cloud, it probably has like a password, right? And so we got to go through the process of logging in and accessing data. Now, the data, and this is where we really start to go more into like past life regression and looking at things of that nature, houses all sorts of things. Not merely information that we and our soul is privy to. It also has experiences that can have a very real effect upon us here and now. And this is where the past life piece comes into play, because we can have, for example, a past life where I experienced maybe a traumatic death experience, or perhaps I wronged someone in a very mean way, and that energy still resides within the cloud. And so when we are then going through these different experiences in life, or rather emotions, and we're not quite able to put our finger on why it is that I react so strongly in this specific way, sometimes it can come from an influence beyond this life, right? We already talked about that in terms of the lineal aspect and epigenetics, how the beliefs, thoughts, and values of our ancestors can have an effect on us here and now. And there is a piece that comes into play with that data that's held within the morphogenetic field. Now, the morphogenetic field in this case is a part of what's being expressed and experienced within our own emotional state. Now, the astral realm, as it comes into play, then has and houses all of this information about ourselves. Often it's operating in the back office, if you will, behind the scenes. And what's happening right now in terms of bringing our awareness are usually things that we're reacting to. The more emotional energy that we have upon an experience, the greater that experience has, irrespective of time and space, has upon freeing ourselves from a certain pattern. And that pattern, as we talked about at the very beginning, is tied to what we call personal narrative. And these are stories that we have about ourselves. And so as we look at this, and we're going to end on that, as we look at this, what is the story that we're going through right now? And what are the emotions associated with this story? Now, as we start to ask with curiosity, and to a certain degree not fully attached to the outcome, these more poignant questions, things start to trigger. As things start to trigger, this is where we want to come back to our tools, our spiritual hygiene, clearing, cleansing, and purifying, as well as with this week, our breath work for letting go. Notice what you're experiencing, the emotions and the feelings, and through breath, allow that to be released and let go from yourself, and eventually and ultimately from yourselves. That's it for now, though. Love and aloha to you all. Take care of each other, and ahui ho.